Welcome, gentle soul, to another quiet visit with the past. In tonight's episode, we'll step into another world, familiar in its humanity, yet distant in time. Maybe you're listening as your thoughts begin to slow, or perhaps you're already resting with heavy eyes. However you found your way here, I'm thankful. I'd love to know where you're re-listening from and what time of day it is for you. The idea of this quiet story floating across the world always makes me smile. If these bedtime journeys through history bring you calm, don't forget to subscribe. There are so many more peaceful nights ahead. Most of us think we know the story of the Salem Witch Trials. A few young girls accused some townspeople of witchcraft. Hysteria spread, and some unfortunate souls were executed before cooler heads prevailed. It's often portrayed as a cautionary tale about superstition triumphing over reason. But this sanitized version barely scratches the surface of what actually happened in Salem Village and the surrounding areas. The truth is far more disturbing, far more complex, and far more revealing about human nature than most people realize. What unfolded in Salem wasn't just a case of religious extremism or adolescent attention-seeking. It was a perfect storm of social tensions, economic disputes, personal vendettas, and psychological manipulation that created a killing machine fueled by fear and sanctioned by the very institutions meant to protect the innocent. Today, we're going to explore why the Salem Witch Trials were worse than you thought. We'll examine the calculated cruelty of the interrogation methods, the systematic way evidence was manufactured, and how the legal system itself became a weapon against the defenseless. We'll meet the real people behind the famous names and discover how their stories reveal a community that had completely lost its moral compass. But perhaps most disturbing of all, we will see how the mechanisms that enabled Salem's horror show aren't relics of a bygone era. The same psychological and social forces that turned neighbors into executioners are still with us today, lurking beneath the surface of our supposedly civilized society. The Salem Witch Trials began in the winter of 1692, when 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, daughter and niece of Salem Village's minister Samuel Parris, began experiencing what their doctor diagnosed as supernatural afflictions. The girls would scream, throw themselves on the ground, contort their bodies into impossible positions, and claim to see specters of witches tormenting them. But here's what most accounts leave out. These weren't random, spontaneous fits. The girls had been experimenting with folk magic, trying to divine their future husbands using an egg white dropped in a glass of water. When their fortune-telling sessions went wrong, possibly producing disturbing or unexpected results, the girls found themselves trapped between their Puritan community as strict prohibitions against such practices and their own fear of punishment. Rather than confess to their forbidden activities, they chose a different path. They began claiming they were victims of witchcraft, transforming themselves from potential sinners into innocent sufferers deserving of sympathy and protection. It was a calculated decision that would ultimately cost 20 people their lives. The first 3 women accused were hardly random choices. Tituba was an enslaved woman from the Caribbean who worked in the Parris household and had likely taught the girls some of the folk magic they'd been practicing. Sarah Good was a homeless beggar who had been asking for charity from Salem families, making her an easy target for a community that viewed poverty as a sign of moral failing. Sarah Osborne was an elderly woman who had scandalized the community by living with a man before marrying him and had been involved in a bitter legal dispute over her late husband's estate. Notice the pattern here. The accusers didn't point fingers at respected community members or people with real power. They chose society's most vulnerable, a slave, a beggar, and a social outcast. These women had no political connections, no economic influence, and no one willing to defend them. They were perfect scapegoats. When these 3 women were arrested and interrogated, something truly sinister began to unfold. The legal system that was supposed to protect the innocent became a machine for manufacturing guilt. The interrogations weren't searches for truth. They were performances designed to extract confessions through psychological torture and manipulation. Magistrates John Hawthorne and Jonathan Corwin, who presided over the preliminary examinations, had already decided the accused were guilty before the questioning began. The questioning followed a predictable pattern, leading questions, threats, promises of mercy for cooperation, and the constant presence of the afflicted girls who would convulse and scream whenever an accused person denied the charges. The most chilling aspect of these interrogations was how they were designed to make denial impossible. If you confessed to witchcraft, you lived but had to name other witches. If you maintained your innocence, you were obviously lying because the afflicted girl's suffering proved your guilt. The only way to escape immediate execution was to become complicit in the system by accusing others. Tituba understood this horrible calculus better than anyone. When questioned, she didn't just confess to practicing witchcraft. She spun an elaborate tale of a devil-worship conspiracy involving multiple witches, mysterious men from Boston, and a book signed in blood. Her confession was everything the magistrates wanted to hear: confirmation that a vast supernatural conspiracy was threatening Salem, justification for expanding the investigation, and a roadmap for finding more witches. But Tituba's confession was almost certainly fabricated, a desperate attempt to tell her interrogators what they wanted to hear in order to save her own life. She had learned that in this new reality, truth was whatever the authorities needed it to be, and survival meant becoming an active participant in the lie. The system that emerged from these early interrogations was diabolically efficient. The afflicted girls became the star witnesses. Their theatrical fits and accusations treated as infallible evidence of supernatural attack. Anyone who questioned their credibility or suggested natural explanations for their behavior immediately became suspect themselves. The magistrates, convinced they were fighting a cosmic battle between good and evil, abandoned any pretense of fair legal procedure. What made this system particularly insidious was how it weaponized the community's existing tensions and grudges. Salem Village was already fractured by disputes over land, church leadership, and social status. Families that had been feuding for years suddenly had a legal mechanism to destroy their enemies. All you needed was to whisper the right words to the afflicted girls, and your rival could be arrested, interrogated, and potentially executed. The Putnam family, who were among the most vocal supporters of the witch trials, had been locked in bitter disputes with several families that would later find themselves accused of witchcraft. Thomas Putnam's 12-year-old daughter, Anne, was one of the primary accusers, and it's hard to believe her accusations were uninfluenced by the adult grievances swirling around her household. As the trials progressed, the definition of evidence expanded to include increasingly absurd forms of proof. Spectral evidence, where accusers claimed to see the ghostly forms of witches attacking them, became the primary means of conviction. The accused were not allowed to see or cross-examine these spectral attackers, making defense impossible. Physical evidence was equally suspect. Unusual marks on the body became proof of devil's marks. The inability to recite the Lord's Prayer perfectly under extreme stress became evidence of supernatural interference. Even successful prayer was sometimes twisted into proof of guilt, with magistrates claiming the accused were using religious words to cast spells. The touch test, where afflicted persons would allegedly be cured by touching their supposed tormentor, was treated as scientific proof despite its obvious potential for manipulation. The afflicted girls had every incentive to continue their performances as they had become the center of attention in a community where young women typically had no voice or power. Perhaps most disturbing was how the legal system abandoned its own principles to accommodate the witch hunt. The normal rules of evidence were suspended. Hearsay became admissible. Did you know that during the Salem Witch Trials, the testimony of convicted witches was accepted against others? Think about that for a second. The court believed people who were supposedly in league with the devil, the father of lies. Defense attorneys? Nope, not provided. And if you tried to defend someone who was accused, you'd likely find yourself under suspicion too. The court accepted evidence that would be considered absurd today. Take Martha Corey's case. When she was accused, the afflicted girls claimed her ghost was attacking them, but they couldn't describe her clothes because she had blinded them. So, investigators went to Martha's house. They found her sitting quietly at home. Instead of seeing this as proof she was innocent, the court twisted it. They decided she must be an incredibly powerful witch, capable of being in two places at once. This is what made Salem so terrifying. It wasn't just superstitious people believing in magic. It was a systematic perversion of justice. The very systems designed to protect the innocent were deliberately corrupted to serve the accusers and the authorities. The trials became a perfect machine for turning suspicion into conviction, fear into death sentences. The speed of it all was breathtaking. Between February and September of 1692, over 200 people were accused of witchcraft. 20 were executed, and several more died in the horrific conditions of the jails while awaiting trial. But these numbers only hint at the real terror that gripped the community. The psychological torture started long before the gallows. The accused spent months in chains, crammed into unsanitary jails where disease was rampant. Families were even forced to pay for their loved ones' imprisonment, adding financial ruin to their emotional devastation. Some died in jail from these appalling conditions, becoming victims of the witch hunt just as surely as those who were executed. The executions were public spectacles meant to reinforce the community's belief that they were doing the right thing. But even in their final moments, the accused often showed more dignity and faith than their accusers. Many maintained their innocence to the very end, forgiving their persecutors and praying for their souls. Their last words often highlighted the profound injustice and the moral bankruptcy of the system that condemned them. What makes the Salem Witch Trials so disturbing isn't just the number of lives lost or the brutality. It's how an entire community became complicit in legalized murder. It's how institutions that were supposed to protect people became weapons against them. It's how quickly civilized people can turn into a mob, baying for blood. The trials reveal something deeply unsettling about human nature and the fragility of justice. They show us how fear can be weaponized, how authority can be corrupted, and how quickly a community can lose its moral compass when gripped by mass hysteria. And most disturbing of all, they remind us that the capacity for such things doesn't belong to a distant, primitive past. It lurks within the human heart, just waiting for the right conditions to emerge. Thanks for watching. If you found this insightful, please like and subscribe for more deep dives into history. But the psychological torment was only the beginning. The so-called evidence used to convict these accused witches reveals just how far Salem's legal system had descended into madness. Spectral evidence became the cornerstone of prosecution. This meant that if someone claimed they saw the ghost or spirit of the accused tormenting them in a dream, that was considered valid proof in court. Think about that for a moment. Dreams and visions were being used to sentence people to death. The judges led by William Stoughton didn't just accept this supernatural testimony. They actively encouraged it. They created an environment where the most outlandish accusations were not only believed, but rewarded. Children who pointed fingers at neighbors were praised for their bravery. Adults who confessed to impossible crimes were spared execution, while those who maintained their innocence faced the gallows. One of the most disturbing aspects was how the trials became a grotesque theater. The afflicted girls would writhe on the courtroom floor, screaming that the accused were pinching them or stabbing them with invisible pins. When the defendant moved their hand, the girls would mirror the motion, claiming they were being forced to copy the witch's movements. The courtroom would erupt in chaos, with spectators gasping and judges nodding gravely as if witnessing genuine supernatural warfare. But here's what makes this even more sinister. These performances were clearly coordinated. The girls had learned that certain behaviors would guarantee the attention and protection of the most powerful men in the colony. They discovered they could destroy anyone they chose simply by pointing and screaming. And the adults who should have protected the innocent instead fed this monster they had created. The speed of the executions was breathtaking. Once accused, defendants had virtually no time to mount a proper defense. Bridget Bishop went from accusation to execution in just 2 months. Others had even less time. The court was operating like a conveyor belt of death, processing cases with ruthless efficiency that prioritized spectacle over justice. What's particularly chilling is how the accusations followed predictable patterns of social prejudice. Women who didn't conform to Puritan ideals of female submission were prime targets. Sarah Good was a homeless beggar who had the audacity to mutter under her breath when refused charity. Sarah Osborne had committed the unforgivable sin of living with a man before marriage. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Salem Witch Trials wasn't the spectral evidence or the property seizures we've already explored. It was how the very foundations of justice itself were systematically dismantled piece by piece until what remained was nothing more than a grotesque theater of predetermined guilt. Picture yourself in that courtroom in 1692, the air thick with tension and fear, or weaponized against them. And the truly horrifying part, the people running these trials knew exactly what they were doing. Let's start with the most fundamental corruption, the burden of proof. In any legitimate legal system, the accusers must prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. But in Salem, this was flipped entirely on its head. The accused had to prove their innocence. And here's the sick joke. How exactly do you prove you're not a witch? How do you prove you didn't send your spirit to torment someone in their dreams? You know, the Salem Witch Trials had this twisted logic. Trying to defend yourself? Well, that just proved you were a witch. Speak too little, you're evasive. Speak too much, you're manipulative. Show emotion, you're evil. Stay calm, you're cold-hearted. It was a no-win situation. But the most messed up part? Confessing didn't mean you were punished. It meant you got to live, as long as you named other witches. The court didn't want truth. They wanted more names to feed the hysteria. So innocent people who refused to lie, like the respected 71-year-old Rebecca Nurse, were executed. Meanwhile, those who confessed and pointed fingers, like the enslaved woman Tituba, survived. The system rewarded lies and punished integrity. The court wasn't just mistaken. They built a machine designed to find people guilty, no matter what. It's a chilling reminder of how easily justice can be corrupted.
How do you prove you didn't make a pact with the devil when no one was watching? The answer is simple. You can't. And that was the point. The court had created a perfect trap. Denied the charges. Well, that's exactly what a witch would do. Confess guilty as charged. Provide an alibi. Your spirit could travel anywhere while your body stayed put. Call character witnesses. They're probably witches too. Or they're lying to protect you. Sarah Good discovered this impossible situation firsthand. When Magistrate John Hawthorne demanded she confess to tormenting children, she maintained her innocence. His response was chilling in its circular logic. Sarah Good, do you not see now what you have done? Why do you not tell us the truth? Why do you thus torment these poor children? When Good continued to deny the charges, Hawthorne pressed further, who do you employ then to do it? Good's honest answer, I employ nobody, was twisted into evidence of guilt. After all, if she wasn't employing anyone else, she must be doing it herself. This wasn't incompetence. This was a deliberate strategy. The magistrates had abandoned any pretense of seeking truth. They'd already decided these people were guilty, and the trials were simply a formality to justify the executions they had already planned. But the corruption went deeper than just shifting the burden of proof. The court had also completely abandoned the standards for admissible evidence. In legitimate legal proceedings, evidence must be reliable, verifiable, and relevant. In Salem, the court accepted the most absurd and unprovable claims as absolute fact. Dreams were presented as evidence. Visions were treated as eyewitness testimony. Spectral sightings, claims that someone's spirit had been seen causing harm while their physical body was elsewhere, were not only accepted, but became the primary form of evidence used to secure convictions. Think about how insane this really was. Imagine if modern courts operated this way. Your Honor, I had a dream that the defendant robbed a bank. Well, that settles it. He's guilty as charged, but it gets worse. The court didn't just passively accept this nonsense. They actively encouraged it. When the afflicted girls would have their fits in the courtroom, writhing and screaming and claiming to see invisible specters, the magistrates would play along with this theater. They would ask the accusers to describe what they were seeing. They would demand the accused explain why their specter was tormenting these poor children. They would even order the accused to call back their spirits, as if this were all perfectly normal and reasonable. During Bridget Bishop's trial, the afflicted claimed her specter was pinching and choking them. Instead of questioning the reliability of such claims, Magistrate Horn asked Bishop, "Why do you seem to act witchcraft before us? By the motion of your body." When Bishop naturally denied doing anything, Hatheron responded, "Is it not your coat that hurts them? Your coat?" They were seriously suggesting that a piece of clothing could commit assault through supernatural means. And this wasn't treated as a joke or a moment of temporary insanity. This was presented as legitimate evidence in a capital murder trial. The accused weren't even allowed to defend themselves properly. When they tried to speak, they were shouted down. When they questioned the accusers, they were told they were being disrespectful to the afflicted. When they pointed out the logical impossibilities in the charges, they were accused of being argumentative and uncooperative. Martha Corey made the mistake of expressing skepticism about the witch trials before she herself was accused when she pointed out that the afflicted girls could simply be lying or mistaken. This skepticism was later used as evidence of her guilt. After all, who but a witch would try to discredit witch trials? The court had created a system where any attempt to defend yourself was treated as further evidence of guilt. Speak too little and you're being evasive. Speak too much and you're being manipulative. Show emotion and you're revealing your evil nature. Stay calm and you're displaying the cold heart of a witch. But perhaps the most sickening aspect of these trials was how they encouraged and rewarded false confessions. In most legal systems, a confession is the end of the process. You confess, you're punished, case closed. But in Salem, confession was treated as the beginning of cooperation. Those who confessed weren't executed. Instead, they were pressured to name their accomplices. They were asked to describe their interactions with the devil. They were encouraged to elaborate on their crimes and implicate others. The more names they provided, the more their own lives were spared. This created a perverse incentive structure. The innocent were executed for maintaining their innocence, while the guilty, or rather those willing to lie about their guilt, were kept alive as long as they continued to feed the machine with new accusations. Tituba, the enslaved woman whose initial testimony helped spark the hysteria, understood this dynamic perfectly. Her confession was elaborate and detailed, filled with descriptions of devil worship and supernatural encounters. She named other witches and described their activities in vivid detail. As a result, she was one of the few accused who survived the trials. Meanwhile, Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother known throughout the community for her piety and charity, was executed because she refused to confess to crimes she didn't commit. John Proctor, a successful farmer with no history of supernatural activities, was hanged because he wouldn't lie about making a pact with the devil. The message was clear. Truth was irrelevant. The court didn't care about actual guilt or innocence. They cared about compliance, cooperation, and the continued feeding of their witch-hunting machine. This corruption was so systematic and thorough that it's impossible to view it as accidental. The magistrates weren't bumbling fools who got carried away by superstition. They were intelligent men who deliberately chose to abandon every principle of justice in service of their own goals. Consider the case of George Burroughs, the former minister, who was accused of being the ringleader of the witches. Burroughs had enemies in Salem who resented his past conflicts with the community. When he was arrested in Maine and brought back for trial, the evidence against him was particularly thin, even by Salem standards. But rather than demanding better evidence, the court simply lowered their standards even further. They accepted testimony that Burroughs possessed supernatural strength based on claims that he could lift heavy objects. They treated his ability to recite Psalm 23 perfectly while standing on the gallows as evidence that he was using witchcraft to appear innocent. The crowd at his execution was actually moved by his dignified behavior and perfect recitation of the prayer. Many began to doubt his guilt, but Cotton Mather, one of the prominent ministers supporting the trials, quickly addressed the crowd and reminded them that the devil could transform himself into an angel of light. In other words, appearing innocent was just more proof of guilt. This is the level of intellectual dishonesty we're dealing with. The court had created a system where literally any piece of evidence could be twisted to support a predetermined conclusion of guilt. Good behavior, the devil in disguise.
But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the Salem Witch Trials wasn't just the corrupted legal system or the fabricated evidence. It was how the accusations themselves became a weapon of social warfare, wielded by those seeking to settle old scores and eliminate inconvenient neighbors. The finger-pointing wasn't random chaos. It was strategic, calculated, and devastatingly effective. Consider the case of Martha Corey, a woman whose only crime was expressing skepticism about the witch trials themselves. When the initial accusations began flying in 1692, Corey made the fatal mistake of suggesting that the afflicted girls might be lying or mistaken. She questioned whether spectral evidence could be trusted in a court of law. For this act of reasonable doubt, she was immediately branded a witch herself. The message was clear. Dissent would not be tolerated. The accusers had stumbled upon the perfect system of social control. Anyone who questioned the proceedings could instantly become a target. It was a self-reinforcing cycle of terror that made opposition virtually impossible. If you dared to speak out against the Salem Witch Trials, you'd likely find yourself in chains. The whole community was held hostage by fear. This wasn't about witches. It was about weaponizing old grudges. Salem Village was already torn apart by fights over land, church politics, and money. Families had feuded for decades, and the trials became a twisted way to settle scores. Take Rebecca Nurse, a respected 71-year-old grandmother. Her family was in a bitter land dispute with the Putnams. So when young Ann Putnam Jr. started having fits and accused Rebecca, it wasn't a supernatural vision. It was the Putnam family using the court to destroy a rival. Most of the accused lived on the east side of the village, while their accusers were from the west. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a power struggle between the two factions. The trials also targeted independent women widows with property, business owners, or anyone who challenged male authority. The system was a brutal way to eliminate competition and enforce social control, all under the guise of religious purity. Have you ever heard of a town that went completely mad? Let's travel back to 1692, to a small village in Massachusetts called Salem. It all started when a few young girls began acting strangely screaming, throwing things, and twisting their bodies into odd shapes. A local doctor couldn't find any physical cause, so he suggested something else: witchcraft. This sparked a massive panic. Soon, accusations were flying, and people started pointing fingers at their neighbors, friends, and even family members. Over the next year, more than 200 people were accused of being witches. Special courts were set up, and the trials were based on flimsy evidence, like spectral evidence, claims that the accused person's spirit had appeared to harm them. In the end, 19 people were hanged, and several others died in prison. It remains a chilling reminder of how fear and hysteria can destroy a community. What do you think really happened in Salem? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. What happened in Salem was worse than we thought, because it revealed something fundamental about human nature and social dynamics. It showed how quickly civilization can collapse when fear overrides justice, when accusation becomes more powerful than evidence, and when the machinery of law becomes a tool of oppression rather than protection. The real horror of Salem wasn't supernatural. It was entirely, devastatingly human. Boring history. Why the Salem Witch Trials were worse than you thought. Part 5. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Salem Witch Trials was unjust the corrupted legal system or the economic exploitation. It was how ordinary neighbors turned against each other with a viciousness that would make medieval inquisitors blush. The social fabric of Salem Village had been unraveling for years before 1692, and the witch trials became the perfect vehicle for settling old scores, destroying reputations, and eliminating inconvenient people from the community. Consider the case of Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother who is by all accounts one of the most respected women in Salem Village. She was known for her piety, her charitable work, and her gentle demeanor. When she was first accused of witchcraft, even the magistrates seemed skeptical. But the accusers persisted, claiming that Nurse's specter had tormented them mercilessly. What made Nurse such a target? Her family had been embroiled in a bitter land dispute with the Putnam family for decades. Thomas Putnam's wife, Anne Putnam Sr., was one of the most vocal accusers in the trials. Suddenly, the accusations against Rebecca Nurse made perfect sense. This wasn't about witchcraft at all, but about settling a generational feud through the most brutal means available. The trials created an atmosphere where suspicion poisoned every interaction. Neighbors who had lived peacefully side by side for years suddenly saw each other as potential threats. A harsh word, a failed recipe, even a sideways glance could be interpreted as evidence of malevolent supernatural power. The accusers, many of them young girls who had initially seemed to be genuine victims, quickly discovered that their claims carried enormous weight. They could point a finger at anyone and watch as that person's life was destroyed. The power was intoxicating, and they wielded it with increasing boldness. Imagine being accused of witchcraft by your neighbors. In 1692, this nightmare became a reality in Salem, Massachusetts. The infamous witch trials were a terrifying blend of paranoia, misogyny, and a deeply flawed justice system. Take George Burroughs, a former minister whose physical strength was used as evidence against him. Or Martha Corey, whose skepticism of the girl's accusations ironically sealed her own fate. And let's not forget Bridget Bishop, the very first person executed, who was known for her outspoken nature and unconventional lifestyle. Their stories reveal how quickly fear can turn a community against its own. The Salem trials serve as a chilling reminder of what can happen when superstition and injustice go unchecked. It's a dark chapter in history that we should never forget. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe for more historical deep dives. The economic dimensions of the trials became even more sinister when we examine the pattern of property seizure. When someone was accused of witchcraft, their assets were often frozen pending the outcome of their trial. If they were executed, their property was forfeited to the crown. This created a direct financial incentive for accusations, particularly against wealthy individuals. Sheriff George Corwin became notorious for his zealous seizure of property from the accused, stripping families of their homes, livestock, and possessions even before trials were concluded. Some families were left destitute, forced to flee Salem to escape both accusation and financial ruin. The case of Philip English illustrates how wealth could make someone a target. English was one of Salem's most successful merchants, with extensive holdings in ships, warehouses, and real estate. When he and his wife were accused of witchcraft, they fled to New York, but Sheriff Corwin seized virtually all of their property. The accusations against English were particularly flimsy. He was said to have appeared spectrally at witch meetings, but there were no other substantial claims against him. His real crime was being successful enough to attract envy and wealthy enough to make his destruction profitable. The psychological toll of the trials extended far beyond those who were directly accused. Families were torn apart as relatives turned against each other, either out of genuine belief or out of fear for their own safety. Children were forced to testify against parents, spouses against each other, and siblings against siblings. The community that had once been bound together by shared faith and mutual dependence became a collection of isolated individuals, each terrified of being the next target. The afflicted girls themselves became trapped in a web of their own making. As the trials progressed, their performances became increasingly elaborate and dramatic. They would fall into convulsions during examinations, claim to see invisible specters attacking them, and provide detailed descriptions of supernatural torments. But maintaining these performances required constant escalation. Each new accusation had to be more dramatic than the last to maintain credibility. The girls found themselves in a kind of performative arms race, where backing down would mean admitting fraud and potentially facing severe punishment themselves. Some historians have suggested that the girls may have initially been genuine victims of some form of mass hysteria, or even poisoning from ergot, contaminated grain. But regardless of how it started, the phenomenon quickly became something else entirely. A calculated campaign of destruction that served the interests of powerful individuals while destroying the lives of the vulnerable. The girls' initial suffering, whether real or imagined, was exploited by adults who saw an opportunity to settle scores and consolidate power. The role of spectral evidence in the trials cannot be overstated in its perversity. This was evidence that only the accusers could see. Claims that the specter or ghostly form of the accused was tormenting them invisibly. There was literally no way to disprove such evidence. If an accused person had an alibi showing they were miles away when the alleged supernatural attack occurred, it didn't matter. Their specter could travel anywhere instantaneously. If they were locked in jail, their specter could still escape to torment the afflicted. This created a situation where accusation was tantamount to conviction, since the evidence was by definition invisible and unprovable. The magistrate's handling of spectral evidence reveals either stunning gullibility or willful participation in a corrupt system increase. Mata, one of the most prominent ministers in Massachusetts, initially warned against relying too heavily on spectral evidence, noting that the devil might use the specter of an innocent person to commit evil acts. But his warnings were largely ignored in the heat of the trials. It was until the trials began threatening members of the colonial elite that spectral evidence was suddenly deemed unreliable. When the accusers began pointing fingers at people like Lady Phipps, the governor's wife, the rules of evidence mysteriously became much more stringent. The trials also exposed the deep class divisions that ran through Massachusetts society. While poor women like Sarah Good were quickly condemned and executed, wealthy and well-connected accused individuals often managed to escape or delay their trials long enough for the hysteria to subside. The message was unmistakable. Justice in Salem was for sale, and the price of innocence was social status and political connections. But perhaps most damning of all was the complete abandonment of legal protections that were supposedly fundamental to English jurisprudence. The accused were denied the right to legal counsel, the right to confront their accusers in any meaningful way, and the right to a fair trial before an impartial jury. Instead, they faced hostile magistrates who seemed determined to extract confessions regardless of guilt or innocence. The presumption of innocence, that bedrock principle of justice, was completely reversed. The accused were guilty until proven innocent, and in many cases, proving innocence was literally impossible. The coercive methods used to extract confessions would be familiar to any student of totalitarian regimes. Sleep deprivation, psychological pressure, threats against family members, and promises of leniency in exchange for confession were all standard tactics. Some accused individuals were subjected to prayer tests where they were forced to recite religious passages perfectly. Any stumble or hesitation was taken as evidence of diabolic interference. Others were subjected to physical tests, like the notorious touch test, where accusers would supposedly be cured of their fits if touched by the witch who was tormenting them. The speed with which the trials proceeded left no time for careful consideration of evidence or proper legal procedures. From the first accusations in February 1692 to the last executions in September, the entire ordeal lasted less than 8 months. In that brief span, hundreds of people were accused. Dozens were imprisoned under horrific conditions, and 20 were killed. The breakneck pace served the interests of those orchestrating the trials, preventing any organized opposition from forming and maintaining the atmosphere of crisis that justified extraordinary measures. As we examine these trials from our modern perspective, it's tempting to dismiss them as the product of a more superstitious and ignorant age. But that interpretation misses the point entirely. The Salem Witch Trials weren't a failure of reason. They were a successful implementation of a system designed to eliminate opposition and consolidate power. The superstition was just the excuse, the mechanism by which rational actors pursued very real political and economic goals. The true horror of Salem wasn't that people believed in witches, but that they used that belief as a weapon against their neighbors. The legacy of Salem extends far beyond colonial Massachusetts. The trials serve as a chilling reminder of how quickly a society can abandon its principles when fear and opportunism converge. They show us how institutions designed to protect the innocent can be perverted to serve the interests of the powerful. Most importantly, they demonstrate the terrible human cost of allowing hysteria to override reason and justice to be sacrificed on the altar of political expedience. The men and women who died at Salem weren't victims of superstition. They were victims of a calculated campaign of terror that used religious belief as a cover for the most base human motivations: greed, revenge, and the lust for power. Their deaths weren't tragic accidents, but murders carried out under the color of law by people who knew exactly what they were doing. That's what makes the Salem Witch Trials not just a historical curiosity, but a warning that echoes across the centuries, reminding us that the capacity for evil doesn't require belief in the supernatural. It only requires the willingness to exploit the fears and prejudices of others for personal gain. And perhaps most chilling of all, the mechanisms that made Salem possible. Fear of the other, the abandonment of legal protections, the weaponization of accusations, and the corruption of institutions. These aren't relics of the distant past. They're tools that ambitious and unscrupulous individuals have used throughout history and continue to use today. The faces change, the specific beliefs evolve, but the underlying dynamics remain disturbingly familiar. Salem wasn't an aberration. It was a template, one that has been followed again and again whenever societies choose fear over reason, expedience over justice, and power over truth. Ever heard of Salem, Massachusetts? Most people think of witches, but the real story is much darker and more complex. It's 1692, and a wave of paranoia is sweeping through a small Puritan community. It all starts when a few young girls begin acting strangely, having fits and screaming. They blame their neighbors, accusing them of witchcraft. What follows is a terrifying spiral of accusations, fueled by religious extremism, social tensions, and outright lies. People were arrested based on spectral evidence claims that someone's spirit appeared to them in a dream. The justice system failed completely. 19 innocent people were hanged, several others died in prison, and one man was pressed to death with heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. The Salem Witch Trials are a chilling reminder of how easily fear and hysteria can corrupt a society, turning neighbors into enemies. It's a lesson from history we should never forget. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe for more. They genuinely believed they were protecting their community from a supernatural threat. But their certainty combined with their willingness to abandon due process and rational inquiry made them participants in a system that destroyed innocent lives. The psychological tactics employed during the trials, forced confessions under threat of execution, the use of children as witnesses, the acceptance of unprovable spectral evidence, created an environment where truth became impossible to distinguish from fiction. In such a system, innocence offered no protection. The only safety lay in confession, in playing along with the delusion, in becoming part of the machinery of persecution. The aftermath of Salem was almost as telling as the trials themselves. When the hysteria finally broke, when respected members of the community found themselves accused, when the governor's own wife came under suspicion, suddenly the entire edifice collapsed. The same officials who had zealously pursued witches now scrambled to distance themselves from their actions. The same spectral evidence that had sent 20 people to their deaths was suddenly deemed unreliable. But the damage was irreversible. Families had been destroyed, communities fractured, and an entire generation traumatized. The survivors carried the scars of Salem for the rest of their lives. A reminder of how quickly the world could turn upside down, how easily neighbors could become enemies, how fragile the bonds of civilization truly were. The Salem Witch Trials serve as a permanent warning about the dangers of abandoning rational thought in favor of fear-driven certainty. They show us how quickly justice can be perverted when we allow emotion to override evidence, when we permit the vulnerable to be sacrificed for the comfort of the powerful, when we mistake hysteria for righteousness. In our modern world, we might think ourselves immune to such collective madness. We have constitutional protections, scientific understanding, and historical awareness that the people of Salem lacked. But the underlying human tendencies that enabled the witch trials' fear of the other, desire for simple explanations to complex problems, willingness to believe rumors over evidence, susceptibility to moral panic, these remain as potent today as they were over 3 centuries ago. Salem reminds us that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance, not just against external threats, but against our own capacity for cruelty when we convince ourselves that cruelty serves a righteous cause. The true lesson of Salem isn't about witches or the supernatural. It is about the terrifying ease with which ordinary people can become instruments of injustice when they surrender their individual moral judgment to the mob. The 20 victims of Salem died not because they practiced witchcraft, but because they lived in a society that had lost its way, that had allowed fear to triumph over compassion, superstition over reason, and vengeance over justice. Their deaths stand as a testament to the consequences of abandoning the principles that separate civilization from barbarism. And their memory serves as a warning that such abandonment can happen anywhere, anytime, to anyone who believes themselves immune to the darkness that lurks within human nature. Looking at the summary and reference files, I'll continue the script from where Part 6 left off, focusing on how the Salem Witch Trials exploited psychological vulnerabilities and social dynamics to perpetuate the hysteria. But perhaps most chilling of all was how the Salem Witch Trials revealed humanity's capacity for psychological manipulation and collective delusion. The accusers didn't simply point fingers randomly. They weaponized the deepest fears and anxieties of their community, turning neighbor against neighbor through a systematic campaign of terror that would make modern propagandists envious. The afflicted girls, led by Abigail Williams and Mercy Lewis, had stumbled upon something more powerful than any spell or potion. They had discovered that in a society built on rigid hierarchies and suppressed tensions, the right accusation at the right moment could topple entire families and reshape the social order. These weren't random outbursts of teenage hysteria. These were calculated performances designed to exploit every psychological weakness in Puritan society. Consider how the girls chose their targets. They began with Tatuba, an enslaved woman from Barbados whose foreign origins and different cultural practices made her an easy scapegoat. They moved on to Sarah Good, a homeless beggar whose poverty and social isolation had already made her an outcast. Then came Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had violated social norms by living with a man before marriage. Each accusation was a carefully chosen arrow aimed at society's most vulnerable members. But the genius of their manipulation lay in how they gradually escalated their targets. Once the community had accepted that outcasts could be witches, the girls began accusing more respectable citizens. They understood that credibility was cumulative. Each successful accusation made the next one more believable. Each execution created a precedent that made the next death easier to justify. The girls had also mastered the art of spectral evidence, a twisted legal concept that allowed dreams and visions to be treated as courtroom testimony. They would writhe and scream in court, claiming to see the invisible specters of the accused tormenting them. When challenged, they had the perfect defense. How could anyone disprove what they claimed to see in the spirit world? How could the accused defend themselves against crimes that existed only in the supernatural realm? This wasn't just legal innovation. It was psychological warfare. The girls had created a system where accusation was tantamount to conviction, where defense was impossible, and where the very act of protesting one's innocence could be twisted into evidence of guilt. They had discovered that in a society consumed by fear of the invisible and unknowable, the power to interpret the supernatural was the ultimate authority. The community's response reveals just how vulnerable human psychology can be to mass manipulation. Family members turned against each other. The girls had created an atmosphere where trust itself became dangerous, where any relationship could be weaponized, where isolation was safer than community. They understood that in a society built on shame and reputation, the mere accusation of witchcraft was often punishment enough. Even those who escaped execution found their lives destroyed, their businesses ruined, their social connections severed. The trials had created a new form of social control, where the threat of accusation kept everyone in line, where conformity became a matter of life and death. The psychological manipulation extended to the confessions themselves. The accused faced an impossible choice: maintain their innocence and face almost certain execution, or confess to crimes they didn't commit and save their lives while destroying their souls. Many chose confession not because they believed they were guilty, but because they understood the game being played. Their false confessions then became evidence used to convict others, creating a snowball effect of manufactured guilt. This wasn't just legal proceeding. It was psychological torture designed to break down individual resistance and create a culture of compliance. The girls and their adult supporters had created a system where survival required complicity, where the only way to escape becoming a victim was to help create new victims. The most chilling aspect of this psychological manipulation was how it transformed ordinary people into accomplices. Neighbors who might normally have been skeptical of outrageous accusations found themselves nodding along in court. Parents who should have protected their children instead delivered them to the executioner. Community leaders who should have demanded evidence instead accepted wild speculation as fact. The girls had achieved something that military conquests and political revolutions often failed to accomplish. They had changed how an entire community thought about reality itself. They had made the impossible seem inevitable. The irrational seemed logical. The cruel seemed necessary. They had weaponized the human capacity for self-deception and turned it against their own neighbors. As the months passed and the body count mounted, some began to question what they had unleashed. But by then, too many people had too much invested in the system to allow it to collapse. Judges who had sentenced innocent people to death couldn't admit their error without destroying their own reputations. Ministers who had preached about the reality of the witch conspiracy couldn't reverse course without undermining their spiritual authority. Accusers who had sent neighbors to their deaths couldn't confess to lies without facing retaliation from the families they had destroyed. The Salem Witch Trials had created their own momentum, a machine of destruction that fed on fear, suspicion, and the very human tendency to double down on mistakes rather than admit error. Picture this: Salem, Massachusetts, 1692. A small, devout community suddenly gripped by a terrifying fear. It all started with a few young girls claiming to be tormented by witchcraft. What followed was a wave of paranoia that spiraled out of control. Neighbors turned on neighbors, and accusations flew like wildfire. The so-called justice system was deeply flawed. Spectral evidence claims of seeing a suspect's spirit committing harm was accepted as fact. People were pressured into confessing and naming others to save themselves. This psychological manipulation fueled the hysteria, leading to a horrifying cycle of accusations and trials. In just over a year, more than 200 people were accused, and 19 were tragically executed, with several others dying in prison. The Salem Witch Trials serve as a chilling reminder of how easily fear, superstition, and a broken justice system can lead to devastating consequences. It's a dark chapter in history that we must never forget. Thanks for watching. The theory held that if a witch touched their victim, the supernatural torment would cease. So, the accused would be forced to place their hands on the writhing accusers. When the girls stopped their theatrical fits at the moment of contact, this was presented as definitive proof of witchcraft. Of course, the accusers controlled this supposed test entirely, choosing when to continue or stop their performances based on the desired outcome. But perhaps most insidiously, the judges created a system where confession became both salvation and damnation. Those who confessed to witchcraft were typically spared execution, at least temporarily. They could save their lives by admitting to crimes they never committed. However, these confessions came with a terrible price. The confessor was then expected to name accomplices to identify other witches in the community. This created an ever-expanding web of accusations, as each coerced confession generated new suspects. Imagine the impossible choice faced by someone like Tituba, the enslaved woman whose initial confession helped launch the entire crisis. Faced with likely torture and certain execution if she maintained her innocence, she chose to weave an elaborate tale of devil worship, flying through the air and attending witch meetings. Her confession not only saved her life, but gave the authorities exactly what they wanted to hear, validating their belief that a vast supernatural conspiracy was indeed at work in Salem. The psychological pressure applied to extract these confessions was extraordinary. The accused were often held in deplorable conditions in overcrowded jails, sometimes for months, while awaiting trial. They were subjected to repeated interrogations, denied adequate food and comfort, and constantly reminded that confession offered their only hope of survival. Family members pleaded with their loved ones to confess, prioritizing life over truth. Some of the most heartbreaking cases involved individuals who initially maintained their innocence but eventually broke under this relentless pressure. Mary Warren, one of the original accusers who later tried to recant her testimony, found herself accused when she attempted to tell the truth. Under intense interrogation, she eventually returned to her role as an accuser, demonstrating how the system corrupted even those who tried to resist it. The trials also revealed how quickly neighbor could turn against neighbor when fear and suspicion took hold. People who had lived side by side for decades suddenly viewed each other with deep mistrust. Old grudges were reframed as evidence of supernatural malice. Property disputes became proof of diabolic revenge. Social tensions that had simmered beneath the surface for years erupted into life and death accusations. Imagine being 71 years old, a respected grandmother, and a pillar of your community, only to be accused of witchcraft. This was the terrifying reality for Rebecca, nurse during the infamous Salem Witch Trials of 1692. Despite being known for her piety and good character, Rebecca found herself caught in a wave of mass hysteria. When the accusations first flew, many of her neighbors couldn't believe it. 40 of them signed a petition testifying to her innocence, a brave act in such a fearful time. During her trial, the jury initially found her not guilty. But under immense pressure from the magistrates and the public outcry, they were forced to reconsider. Tragically, Rebecca, nurse, was convicted and hanged on July 19, 1692. Her story is a heartbreaking reminder of how fear and injustice can consume a society. It stands as a powerful testament to integrity in the face of madness. Thanks for watching. Dorothy Good, the daughter of accused witch Sarah Good, was only 4 when she was arrested and jailed for months. The psychological trauma inflicted on these children was immense. Yet the authorities showed no mercy based on age. The trials had created a monster that fed on fear and grew stronger with each execution. Every hanging validated the judges' belief that they were engaged in a righteous battle against supernatural evil. Every confession confirmed their suspicions about the extent of the diabolic conspiracy. The system had become self-perpetuating, generating its own evidence and justifying its own existence through the very destruction it caused. As summer turned to fall in 1692, Salem had become a community where terror reigned supreme, where neighbor feared neighbor, and where the mere accusation of witchcraft could lead to death. The trials had revealed the darkest aspects of human nature, showing how quickly civilization could collapse when fear overcame reason, when authority abandoned justice, and when communities allowed hysteria to replace humanity. Welcome back, fellow history enthusiasts. Before we delve deeper into this dark chapter of American justice, I'd love to know where you're retuning in from tonight and what drew you to learn about these troubling events. Whether you're settling in for the evening or taking a break from your day, I'm grateful you've chosen to explore this sobering piece of our past with me. If you find value in these detailed examinations of historical injustice, please consider subscribing to join our community of curious minds. Now, let's continue our journey into the Salem Witch Trials, where we'll uncover how a combination of personal vendettas, social manipulation, and institutional failure created one of America's most shameful episodes. In our previous segments, we've seen how spectral evidence corrupted the legal system, how fear and hysteria consumed entire communities, and how coerced confessions became tools of oppression. But there's another crucial dimension to this tragedy that makes it even more disturbing than most people realize. The calculated use of witchcraft accusations as weapons in long-standing personal and political conflicts. The Salem Witch Trials weren't just a product of mass hysteria or religious extremism. They were in many ways the culmination of decades of simmering resentments, property disputes, and social tensions that had been festering beneath the surface of colonial Massachusetts life. What makes this particularly chilling is how certain individuals recognized the trials as an opportunity to settle old scores and eliminate rivals under the guise of rooting out evil. Consider the case of Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old woman whose family had been embroiled in a bitter land dispute with their neighbors, the Pottenhams, for over a generation. The conflict stretched back to the 1640s when Rebecca's husband, Francis Nurse, had purchased a large tract of land that the Pottenhams believed rightfully belonged to them. For decades, this dispute had poisoned relations between the families, spawning lawsuits, arguments over property lines, and accusations of theft and fraud. When the witch trials began, it was Ann Putnam, Sr., who first accused Rebecca Nurse of witchcraft, claiming that Nurse's specter had tormented her and her daughter. But this wasn't a case of supernatural persecution. It was the weaponization of fear and superstition to destroy an enemy. The timing was no coincidence. Just months before the accusations began, the Nurse family had won yet another legal victory in their ongoing property dispute, further infuriating the Putnams. What followed was a systematic campaign to destroy not just Rebecca Nurse, but her entire family line. The accusations spread to include other members of the Nurse clan, creating a web of alleged witchcraft that threatened to eliminate the Putnams' rivals entirely. The tragic irony is that Rebecca Nurse was known throughout the community as a woman of exceptional piety and charity. Even some of Salem's most respected citizens testified to her good character, recognizing the accusations for what they truly were. But character witnesses meant nothing in a system that had abandoned rational evidence in favor of spectral testimony. When 39 of Salem's most prominent residents signed a petition defending Rebecca Nurse, it only served to expand the circle of suspicion. Several of the petition signers themselves soon found their loyalty questioned, and some faced accusations of their own. This pattern of using witchcraft accusations to settle personal grievances wasn't limited to the Nurse-Putnam feud. Throughout Salem and the surrounding communities, the trials became a vehicle for resolving disputes that had nothing to do with supernatural evil. Property boundaries, business rivalries, marital conflicts, and social resentments all found expression through accusations of witchcraft. The case of Martha Corey illustrates another dimension of this calculated cruelty. Corey had made the fatal mistake of expressing skepticism about the initial accusations against Tituba and the other accused women. In a community gripped by fear, such skepticism was itself seen as evidence of guilt. How could an innocent person doubt the reality of witchcraft unless they were in league with the devil themselves? Have you heard of the Salem Witch Trials? It was a dark time in American history, filled with paranoia and accusations. But one story stands out for its sheer defiance: the story of Giles Corey. Giles was an 80-year-old farmer accused of witchcraft. Knowing the trials were a sham, and that pleading guilty or not guilty would result in his property being taken from his family, he chose a third option: silence. He refused to enter a plea. The court, furious, resorted to an old, brutal punishment called pressing. They laid heavy stones on his chest, demanding a plea. But Giles Corey's only response, his last words, were more weight. He died under the pressure, but his incredible act of defiance ensured his farm would pass to his sons-in-law. His story is a powerful reminder of integrity in the face of injustice. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories from history. Good was a homeless beggar who wandered through Salem, asking for food and shelter. Her poverty and desperate circumstances had made her unwelcome in many homes, and she had developed a reputation for muttering curses when refused charity. When livestock died or children fell ill after Sarah Good had been turned away from their doors, it was easy for people to connect these misfortunes to her presence. But this wasn't supernatural causation. It was the scapegoating of a woman whose poverty and desperation made her an easy target for community frustrations. Sarah Good's fate was sealed not by any evidence of witchcraft, but by her status as an outsider with no one to defend her. The execution of Sarah Good on July 19, 1692, was accompanied by a moment that crystallized the trial's fundamental injustice. As she stood on the gallows, Reverend Nicholas Noyes declared that she knew she was a witch. Good's response has echoed through history: "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard. And if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." Whether Sarah Good intended it as a curse or simply a prediction of divine justice, her words proved prophetic. Reverend Noyes died 25 years later, choking on his own blood. But more significantly, her defiant final statement captured the moral clarity that had been so conspicuously absent from the trials themselves. In her last moments, this impoverished and friendless woman spoke truth to power with a courage that the educated ministers and magistrates of Salem had utterly failed to display. The systematic targeting of vulnerable populations reveals another layer of the trial's horror. Women like Sarah Good, who lacked social protection, were disproportionately likely to face accusations. So were those who had challenged social norms in other ways. Women who had inherited property, who had engaged in business, or who had otherwise stepped outside traditional gender roles. Bridget Bishop, the first person executed in the Salem trials, fit this pattern perfectly. She was a tavern keeper who dressed flamboyantly, had been married multiple times, and was known for her independent spirit. Her tavern was a place where men gathered to drink and gamble, activities that the Puritan community viewed with deep suspicion. When accusations of witchcraft began flying, Bridget Bishop's unconventional lifestyle made her an obvious target. The speed with which Bishop was tried and executed just 8 days after the special court of Oyer and Torino was established suggests that her fate was predetermined. The authorities needed a quick conviction to establish the court's legitimacy and demonstrate their commitment to rooting out witchcraft. Bishop's reputation and lack of powerful allies made her the perfect first victim. But the targeting of social outsiders was only part of a broader pattern of how the trials reinforced existing power structures while appearing to challenge supernatural evil. Ever wonder what really fueled the Salem witch trials? We often hear it was all about religious hysteria and superstition. But what if there was more to the story? What if it was also about power, control, and cold, hard cash? Think about it. In 1692, Salem was a community under pressure, with deep social divides and economic disputes. Accusations of witchcraft weren't just random. They often targeted women who were outsiders or who stood to inherit property. If someone was convicted, their land and assets could be seized. Convenient, right? The trials became a powerful tool to silence dissenters, settle old scores, and redraw property lines. It shows how fear can be manipulated for personal and political gain. It wasn't just about witches. It was about who held power and who paid the price. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this look into history's darker side, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.